Acharja Gael, you're standing at the front door of episode 38 of the Rebel Matters podcast. So kick off your shoes and come on in. Make yourself at home. I'm your host, Anlo Carolan, as usual. And it's a bloody good week for the podcast. This is episode 38. I'm after getting myself into a good routine where I'm recording the bits and pieces and working on the podcast on Thursday to make sure that we get it out on Friday. And we're getting one out consistently, and it's fucking brilliant that people are listening to the podcast as well. This is probably the first week where we've had a good load of messages coming into the Facebook page and a good lot of feedback about last week's episode, which was Ask Gilliga, and it was a really good episode for me personally because I got to sit down and ask my dad loads of questions about what it was like in Belfast growing up for him, and how he got involved in the Irish language movement, which he's very well known for, and it's not every day that you get to do that. And it was also really nice to get feedback from people who were like saying they listened to it and that they were also trying out their couple of fuckle, which is really good. This week kind of feels like the Rebel Matters podcast is a real podcast now because of the fact that people are getting in touch through the various social media outlets that we're on, and a few messages came in from Facebook. So I just want to give a shout out to Ray McCrossan, who got in touch saying he was listening to the podcast, Joe Kane and Kane Murphy on Facebook. Thanks a million for all the support, lads, and for getting in touch and for sending messages. I've also been checking out the map on Libsyn where the podcast is hosted, and it tells you like where people around the world are listening to the Rebel Matters podcast. Got like Norway, a pile of listeners in Sweden, Finland, good few in Canada actually. Oh, there's one person listening in Ecuador. Keep it real, mate. Can you guess that? One person in Malawi, one in South Africa, and then a big pile of people listening in down in Australia. And one of the lads who trains with us in the gym, Seamus Kennedy, is I've been having some really good podcast chats with him, and Tom Kennedy is in Brisbane listening to the podcast, Seamus' cousin. So it's really good to have people listening around the world, and also to hear like firsthand that people like say, like Seamus come in and be like, yeah, my cousin Tom was listening to the podcast in Brisbane. I was like, what? No way. Class. So fucking Gormaga Tom has to be guest jacked, and drop me a message or something if you want to through Facebook or Instagram. Another reason why this is a cracker day for the Rebel Matters podcast is the Patreon account is off the ground. The Rebel Matters podcast is on the Patreon platform, and you can find it in patreon.com/Rebel Matters. And this week we got our first patron, Mridni Crui, Guramila Maigat as Shinu Sus done Patreon. I guess because of this, I'm now a professional podcaster. As of this minute, the Rebel Matters podcast is a professional podcast. All the episodes so far have been amateur because the Patreon wasn't really off the ground, and now it is, so it's a professional podcast. Bloody good feeling. Guramila Maigat. If any of you out there who are listening to the podcast now fancy supporting the Rebel Matters podcast in that way, then you can find it on Patreon. But also, it is a massive help when people share the episodes, and a good kind of motivation booster for me whenever you leave comment under something or ask a question about the podcast, or even just drop a wee message on the social media to let me know that you're out there and you're listening. And I think we're building something pretty nice here, so I'm going to keep it going. We're going to keep this train going all the way until it's no longer any crack, and if it's shite crack you can let me know as well, but I probably will keep them going because I'm enjoying doing them. This week's episode is a conversation with John Fleming, who I've known for a number of years now, mainly because of the fact that he's been working with us as a member in Ackley, but more recently he's been helping us out, and he has been bringing our team at Ackley through a course that is based around transactional analysis, which is what John does as his professional as part of his professional career. John's a counsellor, he's a coach and a trainer. He also works in the Sexual Health Centre in Cork, and you can find out more about him on johnfleming.ie, which is his website, and that has a lot more information about the transactional analysis stuff that we start talking about today, and that John has been covering with us as a team in Ackley. And in the episode today, we got into a really nice conversation about mental health and mental health in Ireland, more specifically transactional analysis. John's work in the area of mental health, and we also talked about sexual health, which is another area that John works in. So it was a really nice conversation, and actually when I was listening back to it, I had to do very, very, very minimal editing, just 1 or 2 times whenever I whacked the table by mistake, and I edited it so that it wasn't a big assault on your ears while you were listening to the conversation between myself and John. So let's just get stuck straight into it. As usual, get in touch and let me know what you think about the episode when it's over, and share the episode around on your social media. I think this is an important episode of the Rebel Matters podcast because of the fact that we're discussing something that's so topical and so important today. And it is especially an episode that I would like to hear from people about in and around that area of conversation. So you know what to do and you know how to get in touch. You can do that after you've listened to the episode. But anyway, enough chatting. Let's get stuck into the conversation with John Fleming. Thanks very much for coming into the studio to do the podcast, John. So maybe it would be a good place to start if we start from the beginning, and you can tell people who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So my name's John Fleming. I come from a small village in West Cork called Timleague.
Which is also where my granny's from.
Yeah, exactly. Great place to come from. All the best people in the world come to.
So I believe.
I grew up on a dairy farm there, had a pretty regular life, went to school in Clonakilty, and probably when I was a young teenager, developed a really strong interest in psychology and mental health. And I think people develop these interests normally because they're having their own experiences around it. So I would have been somebody that struggled when I was a teenager with mental health issues. And I think that's a leniency in towards developing an interest there, because oftentimes people who are really interested in sport go on to do things like PE teaching or become a trainer. So in those formative years, you kind of form your main interests. So I've been working probably for the last 5 years in and around Cork, mainly in loads of different facets around mental health and personal development. So currently I work in private practice in Cork City and in Clonakilty, and I work mainly with young people, mainly with young men who are experiencing a wide variety of issues, from depression to anxiety and everything in between. I work in the Sexual Health Centre, which is an NGO in the city centre in Cork. I work there with young LGBT people and predominantly with young trans people at the moment around gender identity. I also host and facilitate Transformers, which is a youth peer support group with a therapeutic focus for young trans people in Cork, and that's organised by TENI, Transgender Equality Network Ireland. I run personal development courses in Cork City and Clonakilty myself, which have a focus of using a method of psychology called transactional analysis. And I'm also working in schools in a private capacity, just to add to the list, doing kind of well-being programs, because obviously that's a huge focus now for the junior cycle. And I've developed a program called Being Well in the World, to meet that kind of criteria, to help young people understand themselves and their relationships with other people better.
That's a pretty long list of stuff that you're involved in at the minute. Here, when you like you mentioned there, when you were a teenager, you developed an interest in mental health. But mental health today is kind of in the public domain, a bit more being talked about. But like 15 years ago, it wasn't so much a thing that was talked about. I think there was maybe a little bit more of a stigma around it or something like that. That'd be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think that Ireland has transformed, particularly over the last 5 years, but prior to that there would have been a lot of stigma attached to mental health. I think I use the words mental health now and I don't even blink, but mental health is not something I talked about when I was 14, 15 years of age. I wasn't even aware that I had mental health problems. That's very much a reflection from where I am today. At the time, I just knew that I wasn't okay. And I didn't really have the words to push with that. I didn't really understand it. And talking to people about it was difficult because it's not something that there was an avenue to talk to about it. You know, I knew that if I hurt myself or if I was feeling unwell physically, that it would be okay to speak to my parents or teachers or peers about that. But there wasn't discussions happening in 2004, 2005 about how you were feeling emotionally. Definitely not.
The Wexford hurling team that won the All-Ireland in around about the mid-90s had actually brought in a sports psychologist called Niamh Fitzpatrick, but they did it like it was like top secret because there was the fear that people would think that they were kind of something wrong with them or something if they were found to be even using a psychologist to get the edge in sport. And that's like in a sporting context, not even in a kind of a clinical or a more health kind of area.
Yeah, completely. I think you have to look at the roots of mental health as well to understand that. You know, in terms of psychiatry is really where it all began, around terms of trying to understand and deal with mental health problems. And psychiatry has its own history, you know, in terms of how it treated people. And I think that created a stigma because once upon a time, if you had a mental health problem, you were kind of seen as mad. You know, that word was thrown around like, oh, sure, he's a bit mad, or, you know, she's tapped, or he's not well, or, you know, she's not with it. And I think that we've come a long way since then. But even up to 5 years ago, I would have said that some of that still really existed, particularly in rural Ireland.
When you're looking back now to your teenage years, can you see particular things that contributed to the issues that you were experiencing with your mental health? Yeah,
I definitely think that Ireland has become a lot more open. I don't think it was as open in 2004, 2005. And I think that definitely was one of the contributions, because I think that if you're growing up in a community or society where there's openness and acceptance about whatever is going on, then it's much easier to deal with some of the issues. But if that isn't there, it almost makes them worse, because what happens is you begin to internalize and you begin to say to yourself, oh, well, this is actually all about me. I'm the problem here because everybody else is okay. So I definitely think that society plays a big role in how we identify, acknowledge and deal with our problems. And if society isn't being open and accepting about them, it actually makes them worse.
So did you feel like that there wasn't the right avenues for you to kind of express yourself or to talk about your feelings whenever you were a teenager? Is that kind of what you're saying there? Or?
I think that on a broader scale there wasn't. I was a very forthright teenager. And I went and sought out what I needed to protect and look after myself. But it wasn't something that was advertised. It wasn't something that I'd been told was available. It wasn't something that was provided to me. It was something that I went and demanded. And no young person should have to do that. So, you know, that's part of the reason that I have overcome the obstacles that were put in front of me. But not everybody has the ability or the know-how to do that. And I think that's important. So, you know, I was lucky. And I do think it was luck.
Like when I listen to you talking about that, like there are probably countless young men and women as well who have probably taken their own lives because of the fact that they weren't able to find their way through and get lucky and have some sort of avenue to get themselves out of the other side. But it's probably very important at this stage that you're here to share your story, and probably by doing so, like, the people are going to be able to relate to it a little bit. Like, what were the particular obstacles that you were going through whenever you were experiencing those things?
I think that I probably didn't fully even understand at the time what was going on. You know, I think that's something that now, having done the training that I've done, I'm able to understand a lot better. I think we actually know very little about ourselves. I think we know sometimes that something is wrong, but we can't really figure out what it was. So there was a lot of factors that were going on for me as a young teenager. I think that I identify as a gay man, and that was something that was definitely kind of at the core of what was going on for me around that key developmental age, you know, in terms of my identity and figuring out who I was. And I think that again, growing up in rural Ireland, there wasn't a whole lot of acceptance. I definitely didn't know any other gay men. There was no uncle or cousin or anybody who was gay, So for me, it was like me. I think the only other gay men I would have seen would have been on TV. And even at that, it was limited. So I didn't really have a clear trajectory of what this would look like. So it was like coming to terms with that. And I think growing up in a small community in 2004, that was a challenge for me that I found difficult. And then there was other things going on in terms of school pressures around, was I a good enough man? Because I wasn't particularly into sport or things like that. And I think I really started to make some decisions about myself of, well, to be a good man, you have to be sporty and you have to be tough. And I wasn't either of those. I was quite sensitive, and I liked arts and humanities and things like that. And that's not what my peers were into around that time. So I was starting to ask myself some really hard existential questions about who I was. And I think as a 14-year-old boy growing up in a small community, that's difficult because I didn't have the skills to understand what was going on. I didn't have the skills to understand that these were existential questions and that everybody goes through them. I just felt kind of trapped and alone.
Something that you said there really sticks out, that you said that you didn't really know at the time that was like there was what was up or that was something wrong, and it's only by looking back now, which is like, that's like a really important message from a mental health point of view, that if you're feeling like there's a dark cloud hanging over you but you can't put your finger on why it is, that there is probably a reason for it, but it's important to realize that you can come out the other side of it, and at some point then maybe you don't need to make sense of it at the time, I guess, is the thing. Like, it's hard to make sense of something when it's so intense and it's happening right there and then, but to come out the other side, and then eventually, like you're saying, you may be able to look back and say, I can see like why I was like that now, but I didn't see it at the time.
100%, Anla. I think that's a really important message, because mental health is vastly different from physical health in the sense of, if you get an infection, they're normally able to identify what the infection is really quickly. They know what the root problem is. They can give you treatment for it and it gets better. But with mental health, it's not always that obvious. And I think even with the way public services around mental health are even structured today in Ireland, it's very much a medical model, and I don't think that works all the time. It works in some instances, but not everyone, because it's a kind of a catch-all system, and people are different. We're all unique in some aspects. So if there is young people out there who are struggling, I think that is an important message that I would like to send them, is that, you might not know what it is or what the root of it is, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing wrong. So if you can get some validation out of the fact that just the fact that you're feeling off could be enough to be telling you that there's something going on, but you might not figure out for a while what that is, and to just trust yourself. And I think that as a practitioner, I very much take the stance of offering young people contracts for support and care rather than always contracts for change, because change can only happen when somebody actually figures out what's going on. But what are they meant to be doing in the intermediary? It might take them a couple of years to figure out what's going on, and then we can start doing some change work. But in the run up to that, they need lots of care and support. So I'll be offering people care and support while they're figuring that out.
It's interesting to hear you say that. Whenever I was over in Palestine, one of the messages that I got from a couple of different people was that it's impossible to deal with trauma as it's happening. It's like, after the trauma, then you have to do what you have to do to get through the initial kind of like dark stages, and then afterwards, then you can start to try and heal the wounds as such.
100%, yeah, 100%. And I think that that's where we really need to differentiate between physical and mental health. There's an awful lot of talk at the moment about how connected they are, which they are. So that's not what I'm challenging. What I'm challenging is the process behind dealing with it, and that is that you can't rush into it. So like with physical health, you're not going to be able to do 6 sessions of therapy and fix a problem. Whereas I think the medical model often wants to achieve results in kind of tight time frames. So for example, the NHS in England, which offers an awful lot of therapy at a primary care level, so in GP practices, they'll offer people 6 sessions of CBT. And it's like, well, it's a bit unrealistic to get somebody in who has maybe been suffering with depression or anxiety for a few years and to give them 6 sessions of CBT and think that they're going to be able to walk back out into the world and live a happy life. The 6 sessions for me would be more about offering care and support. But I think that the medical model and the public services don't look at it that way. They look at 6 sessions fixed onto the next person. And I think we need to start challenging how we look at these things, you know, that it's a long process as opposed to a quick turnaround.
You know, you mentioned that about your experiences when you were a kid that kind of like influence your career path and how you're doing. I think that probably has a lot of value to you as a therapist, not in a way to say like kind of blowing your own trumpet or anything out there, like, but it must be a really sort of strong asset to you if you're working with other people that you've gone through your own kind of issues and you've dealt with them, that they can relate to it. That's like seems to be one of the main things that people need, someone to connect with, and they can.
Yeah, I think one of the core qualities that I would look for in any good therapist is empathy. And I think we sometimes get confused between what sympathy and empathy is. And if anybody's listening isn't sure, then Brene Brown has a really quick, short YouTube video that highlights the difference between sympathy and empathy. So you should just go check that out and it'll tell you pretty quickly. But for me, it's all about empathy. And that is just about understanding where the other person's at. I don't rush in to fix the problem, to minimize the problem, to devalue the problem. I just look to validate it, you know. So it might be as simple as just saying to somebody, I can really hear where you're at, you know, and it's shit. I know what that place looks like and it's not nice to be there. And sometimes young people need to hear that, particularly from somebody who is young as well. You know, I think that's another thing, that feedback I'm constantly getting is that I get a lot of clients coming to my door because of my age. And typically the therapeutic profession in Ireland hasn't attracted many young people because there's not the career paths into it from university. It's something you have to study part-time, by night or on weekends, and you can't fill out a CA form to become a counsellor and psychotherapist, which I think is a shame, because there's a lot of young people out there that would be very good at this job.
Brene Brown, who you mentioned there, wrote a book called Rising Strong. It's actually sitting up on the shelf there.
Ah, very good.
So people can check that out if they want to.
Yeah,
and actually, people can come to the Ackley Book Club and borrow it if they want to. But one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast with you was because you're at the minute bringing the team at Ackley through a course in transactional analysis, which is a lot of the work that you're doing at the minute anyway. And I was like absolutely buzzing after the first session that we did, or the first 2 sessions that we did on the last day. So tell us a little bit about that there. What is transactional analysis?
So I'm going to start calling it TA for short, because it's just easier, so you all know what I'm referring to. So TA is a psychological theory developed in the 50s by a guy called Eric Byrne. He was originally from Canada and then moved to the States. Really interesting character. He basically founded transactional analysis because he didn't like what was going on in the psychoanalysis profession in the States around the time. What he was observing was that there was a superiority complex, I can't speak that all of them were like that, but this is just his experience and I'm reiterating it, is that what he was seeing was that these doctors in white coats, who might have also been psychiatrists and practicing psychoanalysts, were really looking down on people. You know, one key part is they were calling them patients, not clients. So most of us who are therapists these days will call our clients, not patients. We don't look at them as being sick or ill. Unless you work in psychiatry, which is very different frame of work. And he really wanted to develop a theory and practice that kind of held these people in an okay place. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a second. So he developed this theory in the 50s, and it's kind of been ever growing and evolving since. And if I was to kind of put it in one sentence, I would say that TA is a easy to understand set of simple models, which all come with diagrams, that help you understand who you are, what your relationship with yourself is like, and how you relate to other people. Which is very powerful, because you can teach this stuff to an 8-year-old and they'll understand it. And that was the other key thing that Eric Byrne wanted to do. He wanted to develop a theory that anybody could understand, even a child, because at the time a lot of the psychological theory out there was very highfalutin, lots of psychobabble, jargon, and really it was almost like reading a legal paper, but it's kind of like psychological words, and it was very difficult to understand. So the positive of TA is that when you're working with a client, whether it be in a therapeutic setting or somewhere else, you can share the theory with them. You can help them integrate their understanding by actually teaching them some of the theory. Whereas prior to that, it would be kept secret. It would be like, oh, well, we won't tell the patient what's wrong with them.
They were just getting the sort of like the final piece
of
like
the diagnosis or whatever, and then your label, you have this, whereas I suppose definitely my kind of approach to my work is very much co-creation. So I would think that I'd be kind of co-creative professional, whether I were working in education or in a therapeutic setting, and that me and the client are co-creating the work, that they're bringing as much value to the space, if not more, as I am, that it's not just all about me, the professional. So I found TA in, I think it was probably around 2012. I was a management consultant at the time, and we were doing some management training, and one of the modules was on TA, and we covered ego states and transactions, and it just blew me away. I was like, oh, this is gold. Like, this is really gold. So I always kind of kept it at the back of my head. And when I made the decision to train as a therapist, I decided to train in the UK. So for the last 4 years, I've been flying back and forth to the UK to train in transaction analysis, because you can't currently train it in Ireland. CIT in Cork offer a psychotherapy course, and 1 whole year is devoted to TA therapy in that course. But I wanted to do TA outright. I was hungry to learn more of this wonderful theory. So yeah, that's what I've been up to.
See, to bring it back a little bit, and why do you think we need TA? Like, sometimes I just look around and I kind of like, when I'm feeling a little bit less positive than I usually am, I'm like, we're completely fucked. There's so many things going on around here that it's a very hard time to have. It's a hard time to look after mental health in a way, and in part because there's so many incoming pieces of information. Like, why do you think that these types of things are so important today?
I think TA in particular offers a lot of hope and optimism. It's a very idealistic theory. So at its core, it's really kind of shining a light saying, actually, everybody is good at the core. Everybody is okay. And I think that theories that offer that level of optimism and positivity are very potent and can't be underestimated, actually, because if they can give somebody that lift and motivation, then I'm all for sharing them. And I think that now more than ever, in terms of our evolution as a global village, and particularly as a society in Ireland, we're asking ourselves more questions about who we are and why we are the way we are than we ever have before. And I think this is probably part of the evolution process. I don't have any evidence to back that up. That's just my personal opinion. But I think that we are now we're asking ourselves more existential questions than we ever have before. And that brings with it its own problems. It creates dilemmas for people, because if people start asking themselves those big questions about who am I, what am I here to do, and what do I want from this life, sometimes the answers they get back to themselves can be challenging, and they need help figuring that out and understanding it. I think also that there's a lot of social change, particularly in Ireland at the moment, but I would say across the world. And I think that also brings with it change in society in terms of how we understand ourselves and understand our emotions. And in a way, there's just been kind of like the lid has been lifted off the repression that once was in Ireland. And I think we're trying to mop up the crap still.
Like, anecdotally speaking, and obviously without breaking any kind of confidence and stuff like that, is there anything like tangible that you see that people are coming to you with, like, for example, like the bombardment of like advertising on social media, or the fact that we're living in a time where like rentals just keep going up for the people who you're working with, young people, like, are probably mostly renting places. Are there tangible things like that are happening in society today that you see are causing issues in terms of health, mental health?
Yeah, there's not any one thing that comes to mind in particular, but I think it's definitely the collective. There is a lot of pressure on young people today in terms of the expectations that's put on them more than anything else, and I think that expectations comes from all directions. I think it comes from parents, I think it comes from peers, it comes from older siblings, and I think it just comes from an old aging population in general about who they have to be, how quick they have to grow up, how okay they have to be, and all of these things.
It comes from advertising as well, like
100%. Yeah, I think social media and advertising, we still don't fully understand the negative impacts that's having, and I think that we won't for a while. Like anything that's still relatively new, the studies haven't been done yet. But from a anecdotal point of view, yeah, like people are definitely under pressure. I see lots of teenagers coming in who are being bullied via social media. They might not even realise that it's bullying, and I think that that's very difficult for them, because what it does is it really impacts their self-esteem and their self-confidence, and they put a lot of pressure on themselves about how they should be performing, and the way they should look and what they should be doing, and there's always the next trend. Every young person that comes into me now sits across from me and I can see a Fitbit on their wrist. And that's a strong message. It's like, because why are 14 and 15-year-olds counting steps and things like that? Like their bodies are still developing, they're still growing, they're at the peak of puberty, and it's worrying. It definitely is worrying.
What I was going to ask you there was, one of the things that struck me from the workshop that we did together in Ackley was the 3 different states of communication: the parent state, the child state, and the adult state. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because I think that was one of the main takeaways that I took away, just to expand my awareness of the levels of communication that I had with people. So
there's a really helpful model in TA called the ego state model. And it's 3 circles stacked one on top of each other. The top one traditionally was the parent, the middle one the adult, and the bottom one the child. And this was developed by Eric Berne as a kind of a continuation of Freud's work around what he was noticing around ego. And it's important that we call them ego states. So it's not that we have 3 egos, but that they're ego states that we move in and out of. So they're not fixed. And it's about what they home, or what they're home to, rather. So the parent ego state is kind of home to our experiences of the big people that were around us when we were growing up, predominantly around the ages of 3 to 7. So teachers, sports coaches, parents, aunts and uncles, anybody who was around the child quite a lot. What we do in TA is we kind of look at, like, what's in that ego state is those people. So you're interjecting your parents, you're interjecting your teachers. So, sometimes later on in life, people say, oh, I opened my mouth and my mother came out. Of course they did, because that leaves an impression on you. And oftentimes what's also in the parent ego state, which is kind of a more functional aspect, is what we refer to as critical and controlling parent in one half of the circle, and in the other half of the circle, the nurturing parent. And it's also about identifying where you might be communicating from. So if you're communicating from your parent ego state, are you coming from a critical place, or are you coming from a nurturing place? And sometimes people might have way more critical parents than they do of nurturing parent, or vice versa. Somebody might have a lot of nurturing parent and a lot less critical parent. And if you're able to look at the big people who you were in your life when you were a kid, you can often see why that is, because you might have had a parent who was very critical, or a parent who was very nurturing. If you go down then to the bottom, to the child ego state, they are thoughts, feelings and behaviours that happen when you were a child. And really your child ego state is a continuation. It's being kind of populated all through your life of old experiences, but nearly always they're connected to things that happened when you were a child. And the functional aspect of that then is that you have the rebellious and adaptive child on one half, so the child that won't do anything, or the child that will say, yes, no problem, I'll do whatever you ask me to. And then on the other side you've got the free child, and that's the child who's kind of carefree, happy, having fun. So you can see already that you can kind of see the negative and aspect sides of the ego state and where you might be communicating from. The adult in the centre then is about the here and now reality. Okay, so the adult isn't thinking about what happened when I was a child, and it's not thinking about what the parent would say. It's reacting to the here and now in an adult way. So, you might ask me a question, and I might react very critically and be like, why are you asking me a question like that for? And that might be a kind of a parent reaction. Or I might just answer the question because you asked me a question. That would be an adult reaction. Do you know what I mean? Or I might say, oh yeah, no problem, I'll answer any question you ask me. That might be adaptive child, One really good way or exercise I use sometimes when I'm teaching this model is I get people to develop voicemail recordings for the different ego states. So like a critical parent voicemail recording would be like, I'm not here right now. You rang at a very bad time. You need to leave your name, your number, your phone number. And if you don't leave it, then I'm not going to be able to ring you back. And that's going to be your fault. You can see that. Whereas a free child might, leave a fart noise on the voicemail recording. So that would be the difference. And an adult then, of course, might just say like, hi, you've reached John. I'm not here at the moment. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. So you can see the very differences there about how we might be communicating from different places.
So I'm just trying to summarize this in my own head so I get a clear picture. And it's kind of good to hear you talking about it again because we haven't really discussed it since the last time we did the workshop. But is it right to say that we all have the potential to have these three different ego states?
We all, the TA would views that we all do have these ego states. Yeah, not the potential. We all have them.
The potential to be in them, though,
yes.
at any one time?
Yes.
Yeah, and then that the ego state that you're in can affect how you make someone else feel or how you feel when somebody else is communicating to you?
Yeah, it could be, yeah. So I suppose the kind of goal really of TA in a therapeutic sense is what we're trying to do is we're trying to make adult bigger. We're trying to make adult stronger. We're trying to make adult the boss in a way, okay? And what we try to do with that is we try to integrate the three ego states into one. So it's like you can have your experiences and know they were experiences you had when you were a child, but you don't need to be reacting from them now, which can be difficult for people. Because time and time again, people get into situations, you're like, why do I always get triggered? Why do I always react like that when this happens or when I'm with that person? The term we use in TA for that is getting rubber banded. You get rubber banded back to somewhere else, somewhere where when you were probably quite a young child. So the aim is to be able to acknowledge the existence of these experiences and realize that they're in the past and they're not happening now, and that what's happening now is different and that it's an adult situation, and to be able to deal with that in an adult way. And the same from the parent. It's about to say, okay, well, you could choose to react very critically to the situation, but is that helpful? Is that really going to sort the situation out? Or could you just stay calm and you could deal with it, particularly when things go wrong?
You mentioned the word there, triggered. I actually only heard that word for the first time about 2 months ago, and I think it's probably a good sign. It's probably a good thing that people are talking about mental health and are kind of realising certain circumstances are awakening feelings that they haven't felt in a while for one reason or another. But interesting, see the terminology. Even is the term adult is kind of a controversial enough term in a way today because of the fact that I read recently that people are getting married much older, having kids much older, or staying in their home house for much longer, so that the term go and be an adult is kind of in the balance now as well. Whereas before it was you left home when you were 18, go and get a job, get married, and then you're an adult and you have a house and you get a mortgage and all. But that's not really happening in the traditional sense anymore because of just the way that things are. Yeah,
well, I suppose I definitely take on board what you're saying, and I suppose it's really important for me to say in terms of protecting TA is that we use parent, child and adult with a capital letter. So it's capital P, capital A, capital C. So we're not talking about whether the person is an adult or a child or not. We're just using that as a way of kind of describing what the reaction might be like. So oftentimes when you're reacting from a child ego state, the behaviour can be quite childlike rather than, saying that they are a child, if that makes sense, because of course once the person is old enough. But I take on board what you're saying. I don't think that there is an age where we become an adult. I definitely remember thinking that was it when I turned 18.
Sometimes I'm thinking, if this is what it's like to be an adult, I was I'll go back, I'll be a kid, no problem, sweet. I'll just stay in child state.
Yeah, it's funny, like, because I think that's something that I talk to the young people I work with now, actually, because sometimes they have this grand idea that, once they turn 18, that's it, great, sorted, life's easy. And I don't think it plays out that way. I think actually, looking back for me now, my early 20s were more difficult to navigate than my teenage years. But of course, when I was a teenager, I didn't know that was going to be the case. But looking back, I think my early 20s were very difficult, because when that breaking away from your family of origin is difficult, and I think that there's a lot going on developmentally as well. People don't really talk about it, but you're in puberty right up till 25. Your body's still growing. Your brain is still growing. Like, the frontal cortex hasn't fully formed until the age of 25. So there's so much going on in the body. And I think that brings with it a lot of other challenges emotionally and psychologically as well, that we tend to underestimate and discount. We don't teach our young people that their bodies are developing and growing until they're 25. And then a lot of people start drinking heavily and doing other things when they turn 18, and actually their body is not in the place. It's never going to be in the place, but particularly while they're going through that period, it can have devastating effects to their overall well-being.
Something that you've mentioned a couple of times so far has been the expectations that people have, or that people think others have of them. And I think that you kind of touched on it there about the kind of expectations of adulthood as such in the modern world. A lot of the times are like, the expectations are that you're go and get a mortgage and you buy a car that you have to pay back, and that you get a job somewhere that you don't really like. And it's like, maybe not connected with the conversation we're having about the adult state as it relates to transactional analysis, but I think it's like, fuck those expectations, like, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, they create a lot of disappointment, actually, and that's the big problem. I think this is rooted into how it creates some of the problems that people face around disappointment, because if they take on these expectations and internalize them, and they don't work out, then they're going to feel disappointed with themselves. They're going to think everybody else feels disappointed. It might even be the case that other people are disappointed in them, and that can be really hard to navigate. In your 20s, between 20 and 30, when still really you're still a young, childlike human, figuring out the world, figuring out how to form relationships, and how to deal with obstacles as they come along.
It's not always a conscious decision to take on expectations either.
No.
Sometimes you can have them and you don't know why you have them.
Completely.
It's because of the influences that you've had.
And that's something that we look at in TA as well, which we call script theory. It's about kind of the life story that we create for ourselves. And in essence, it's a blueprint, and we start writing that from the day we're born. About who we are, the way we are, how the world treats us, what the world is like. And sometimes people can really think that the world is out to get them and is a horrible place, because that's the story they've written. And of course, when you write a story, it's easy then to find experiences and events that can confirm it. And sometimes that's some of the work that I'll do with somebody who may be really ready to do kind of more transformative change work, is kind of rewriting that story and maybe taking on a different view of how the world is. And really the ultimate goal with TA, and this is why it's so idyllic, is to promote autonomy, to promote freedom. Definitely psychological freedom, but to promote autonomy in a greater sense as well, whether it be societal or within just your own community, to give you freedom of expression, freedom to think for yourself, and sometimes just freedom from your own thoughts, because if you've been thinking a certain way about yourself for a long time, sometimes it can be really hard to get away from that. And that's why autonomy is the ultimate goal in TA. And we try to do that through three things, and that is increasing awareness. So that is about really helping somebody understand why they are the way they are, why they react the way they react, and what might have affected that when they were growing up. So that's where we do some psychoeducation as part of the therapy work, where we teach them some theory, and then to really help them increase intimacy. So to be having intimate relationships, whether that's romantic and sexual or not, just intimate relationships. And that's the big one for young men, in terms of sharing with their male counterparts, or female friends for that matter, what's going on for them. like talking about how they feel. And I know this is something that's very much been in the public domain over the last couple of years, and I know Blind Boy talks about it a lot, about how young men don't speak about their feelings and how we have an epidemic in Ireland around that. And I think we do. And the matter, we can talk about it like until the cows come home, but what we actually need to do is start encouraging them to talk. We've identified the problem now. Now, where is the solution? Like, let's get on with it. And I think that's a huge mission for me in my work in schools around delivering wellbeing programs, is to break down the barriers around feelings. Like, sometimes young women have this injunction, that you can't feel anger. And the injunction that men have sometimes is that you can't feel fear.
Is that some kind of conditioning from a young age?
100%. And that comes from parents, but it also comes from society. Like, I definitely had a strong injunction of my own of boys don't cry. Like 100%, and don't feel. I didn't feel anything for a very long time. I can still remember the first day I think I started actually feeling, because what I was just very depressed and sad all the time, but I wasn't feeling everything else that was going on, because my default was to just be depressed. So I think that we really need to be implementing change there, because it's one thing to be saying we're noticing the problem. Now we need to get on with it and solve it. And I think the only way we can break that down is by encouraging your young people to open up and talk. And then the last bit then that we do in TA to promote autonomy is to help people increase the amount of spontaneity in their life. You have to have fun. Like, it's part of who we are. And I think that as we grow older, and I'm using inverted commas around adult here now, like when we get grown-ups, we become very serious. It's like, oh, but I need to be a proper adult now. I need to get a job, buy a car. I can't be having fun anymore. And, simple things, like there was a big movement a couple of years ago around colouring, which I think maybe it became a bit of a commercial ploy in the end, because everybody was out buying colouring books, and that was great for the retailers. But simple things like colouring can be really helpful to encourage us to have more spontaneity in our life. I mean, it's still very structured because you're colouring between the lines, but it's a starting point. So they're the three things that I would say to people. Increase your awareness, intimacy and spontaneity, and you'll have a more autonomous life.
You mentioned something there about scripting, and it kind of, I see that a lot of people probably change their script or change their life circumstances on the back of it, like a major life event. If someone like has a car crash or something and they come out the other side and they decide they're going to quit their job, they're going to do what they wanted to do their whole life. Or if someone gets a divorce or someone gets really sick and comes out the other side, they change it. And it struck me that whenever we did the workshop together, and just in general, we've been thinking about these types of theories and strategies and tools and stuff, that these are like really useful to make positive changes in your life without having to wait for, get hit by a bus first to make it.
100%. Yeah. I mean, in that workshop, I did a goals exercise with you that I'm just thinking back on now. And I think we did 3 sets of goals lists. One was what's your lifetime goals. The other was what's your next 3 years. And then the last one I asked people to do was if you were going to be dead in 6 months' time, what would you do for the next 6 months? And I do that over and over again, because people are always shocked. They're always like, oh, why am I not thinking about all the fun things I'd like to do in my life?
And when I did that list, actually, when I wrote down the list, and I was talking to a couple of other people who were at the workshop as well from the team, I wrote down a list of what I would do if I only had 6 months to live, and I was like, actually, I could just do all these things now. Like, there's things that are well within I have got the time to do them. I just can never give myself the time.
Yeah.
But I just finished a course in, I think we were talking about it before, in Oxford, in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy.
Yeah.
I was flying over every fortnight to do a full day over there, and the thing there was kind of like, I guess it was quite heavy meditation kind of based course, but it had the theory behind it as well. And the thing that I think that I took away from it most is kind of connected to that point I was making about not having to wait for, to get really sick to realize what you have and not to stop taking things for granted. But it was the very fact that that course was based on building more awareness of how you're feeling is probably the most valuable tool that you can use to realize and then identify that you want to give yourself the space to do particular things or certain things.
100%. I think that anything like that is a positive intervention. And I suppose that kind of leads on nicely to the work that I'm doing, or kind of focusing on doing more now, which is more education. Because A tutor of mine in the UK has a very good analogy, and that is that educators are upstream teaching people how to swim, and therapists are downstream pulling people who are drowning out of the river. And if we can teach more people how to swim at this thing called life, then we'll be doing a good job. And I think this is the really big challenge that society has over the next 10 years, is putting more preventative measures into how we treat health in general. Because so much of our health system is focused on cure rather than prevention. And I think we really need to flip that on its head. We need a much more prevention-based aspect, particularly for mental health, because I think so much of what people face could be avoided. I mean, there's always going to be a certain amount of therapy needed. Bad things are always going to happen to people, unfortunately. I sound like a right pessimist when I say that, but I think it's a reality. People are always going to die. There's always going to be bereavement. There's going to be things like that. But I think generally we could be doing a whole lot better. And one of my main focuses going forward now is psychosocial education. And that is teaching young people, or anybody who listens to me for that matter, how to understand their relationship with themselves and other people, and to giving them a simple set of tools and strategies that they can use to do that. And mindfulness-based therapy is one of those things that could be used. I'm just using TA because it's something that I feel passionate about, but there's lots of different ways that this can be done.
Is TA connected with cognitive behavioural therapy in any way?
Not particularly. Cognitive behavioural therapy would have come after TA and definitely borrows from TA in aspects, but I think all of these therapeutic models are interlinked naturally anyway, because they all come from the same roots, which is Jung and Freud. They're all grown out of somewhere. And I think cognitive behavioural therapy definitely has its place. It's just not something that I'm overly familiar with, because it's never therapy I've been on the receiving end of, and it's never something I've done any training in. But TA would be quite cognitive in its roots, so there's definitely strong links there.
It seems to be kind of a Western thing to have a lot of theory and research and stuff behind these types of approaches. And the other side of the spectrum is probably the Eastern philosophy of like meditating, and then their whole kind of like idea there is to get rid of your ego completely. Is there kind of a crossover there in some way, or influences from the two approaches?
Well, I suppose I'm going to sound like I'm plugging TA constantly here now. But
you are?
There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. I suppose that's another unique thing with TA, and one of the other reasons that I was very drawn to it is because it's pulled in all the best bits from all of the different the theories. So we have a whole school now in terms of developing TA in spirituality, which really comes from an Eastern kind of point of view. And it's about incorporating TA into it so that we can use TA to frame it. Because what TA is, more than anything, is it's a way of being, and it's a way of teaching, and it's a way of understanding people. So you can pull anything into TA and analyse it and get a very simple, easy way of looking at something. And I think sometimes that can be the barrier with more of the Eastern methodologies. Some people want to know, but how does it work? Because they might lack the faith or trust in it. And I meditate myself, and I find it very, very, very potent. I think that some of my biggest successes have come down to having meditation practice and keeping myself very grounded in that. But I don't think that anybody has any one answer. I think all of these things combined have a lot of good to give the world. It's just about choosing the one that suits you and works for you. And I would shop around. That's another important message for young people, I think. None of these theories are dull one. They're all just theories, they're not facts. So I would say that if you're wanting to go for therapy, or you're wanting to work with someone on personal development, give it a go. But you don't have to commit. If it's not working, then just end it and then try a different person. Shop around. Like
the same thing I can feel with building a meditation practice. There's different types of meditation, and different types suit different people. And as well as that, I feel like it has got a lot to do with the method or the theory and how it applies to you just at that particular time, the way that you're feeling and stuff like that there. And you'll be picking up stuff a better time. I don't know, like say you'll be feeling the vibes of something at a particular time in your life, and then later on you might not be feeling it. Maybe a different way to do it then.
Yeah, completely. I definitely agree with that. And I think it's just about keeping an open mind. That's definitely another core aspect, I think, of this whole mental health piece that we're talking around. And that is giving people the tools to understand how they can access services. Because, you know, you have a GP since you're a baby. So it's like if you need to go get a GP, then you know where to go. But people are often kind of stumped about, well, where could I go find a counsellor or a psychotherapist, or, you know, who would be somebody that I go to help me with this dilemma or obstacle I got. And I don't think that counselling and psychotherapy is always the answer either. There's lots of other professionals out there who are very helpful. One thing that I signpost people to quite a lot, particularly in their mid-20s, where they might be really being challenged around what they want to do career-wise, is going to see a career guidance counsellor. It's something that I did before I went back and became a therapist, and it was really helpful. So I think we really need to help young people as well understand what services are out there that they can access, so that they are in a better place to choose the right one for them.
It's class. I really like where you're at, because it's kind of an intersection of practice, theory, and not kind of pushing things on people too much. But when I think about the mental health services in Ireland at the minute, and the amount of mental health issues that we have, and the amount of suicides that we have, it's probably fair to say that on a governmental level or an institution level, we're fairly crap at dealing with mental health, like in terms of how we're educating people about it or how we're dealing with the problem.
Yeah, I do think there's an awful lot of issues around that, and I think there's a lack of focus as well. I'm frustrated because as a professional who's gone and done the training, my National Health Service won't employ me, because in order to be a therapist in the HSE, you also have to have a medical qualification. So I'd have to be a nurse, for example, and a therapist in order for them to employ me, because they would employ me as a nurse, but then I'd work as a therapist. I mean, that's crazy. Like, you know, it's like, why does somebody have to have two professions to do one job, you know? So things like that, like I wrote several letters last year to my local TDs, and including to the Minister for Mental Health at the time, Jim Daly, because I was very frustrated about the state of affairs. But I didn't get much joy, really. There's a lot of ambivalence around the issue, and I think the HSE is its own monster in terms of bringing about change that it can be difficult to do in any large organisation like that. But it's just not good enough. It's not good enough when we have young people suffering, and like you say, taking their own life on a weekly basis. We need to be seeing change quicker, and I think we need more funding in that area in particular. And for me, it can't just come at the back end because we have a problem. It needs to be front loaded as well. So I would like to not only see an increase in service provision, but I'd also like to see an increase in education. And the National Council for Curriculum have increased the amount of wellbeing hours now for the junior cycle, which is great, but they haven't given much direction to schools on how to do that, other than that you can increase SPHE, CSB and PE. And that's not the answer to the problem. Like, you know, just because you get a couple of extra SPHE classes a week doesn't mean that your mental health is going to improve. To be fair, there's some really fundamentally great teachers out there who in some classrooms they are helping people improve their mental health. But I think that teachers are in a difficult position around SPHE, because a lot of the time they don't feel like they're the best people to be delivering that subject. They would like to see other skilled professionals coming in to do it. Now, I can't speak for all teachers, but that's what I'm hearing from teachers, is that they feel like other people like me, for example, they'd like to see us delivering that.
If you had a blank canvas to address the mental health issue that we're seeing in Ireland, what would be some of the main things that you would put down?
I definitely think that I put a huge focus, first of all, on education. I think a whole lot needs to be done around development in general, and not just in relation to mental health, but I think that these are some key things that affect people's mental health and continue to do so, because I really see health as a holistic thing. So, for example, we have young people leaving school that are doing honours maths, for example, or algebra, or, you know, applied physics, all of these wonderful academic subjects. They can't cook a dinner. They don't know how to exercise. They don't know how to look after themselves. Now, these are key things that we should be covering as part of education. And some people might laugh at me and say that, well, that's not connected to mental health. It is. Because if you're not getting a good diet, you're more likely to get depression. If you're not exercising, you're more likely to get depression. The first thing I do with any person who comes to me who's depressed is I'll speak about sleep, exercise, and nutrition. Because we can do all the work in the world around how they're feeling, but if they don't get those three things, they're not going to get better. Sleep has a huge effect on how you feel in terms of your hormone levels. And if you're sleeping during the day and awake at night, your hormones are going to be all over the place. So I think that education around health and development in general is crucial, because I cannot believe that it's going to be 2020 next year in Ireland, and that there's teenagers leaving school who can't cook a meal for themselves. I just think, just think about that. Think about it. They're going into universities studying amazingly complicated subjects and doing fantastic professions afterwards, but they can't cook themselves a dinner. I think that's baffling. So that would be top of the list on the canvas, I think, around what I would do in terms of prevention. We're doing our youth an injustice by not giving them the skills they need to lead a healthy life. And then after that, around service provision, I think that a grade needs to be introduced into the HSE for counsellors and psychotherapists, so that the HSE can employ them without having to be a nurse or a doctor as well. And I think that at a primary care level, there needs to be counsellors and therapists available in every GP practice. And I mean, that's a big ask, because right now our primary care is crap as well, because we've got a private GP kind of service at the moment with medical cards, etc. But there is going to hopefully be big change in primary care in Ireland over the next 10 years, and kind of seeing more of an NHS model adopted. And I would like, with that, at the same time, to see an introduction of therapists into primary care and in the community. I think they would be my top two things on that canvas.
I would love to hear someone trying to argue against all those things that you just said, because they're so common sense and needed.
Well, sometimes the most simple things are the best. This doesn't have to be overcomplicated, and the HSE talk about cost benefit analysis all the time. That's all they're interested in. That's how healthcare is run these days. If we use this drug, does that mean less people will be in long-term palliative care, therefore it'll cost us less money? Well, I mean, if you were teaching these kids to be able to cook and clean and look after themselves, they'd be taking less antidepressants and it'd be costing you less money. I think it's win-win.
Here, we've spent the last while talking about mental health, which is unbelievable, and it's one of the main subjects that still, I guess, to some extent is still stigmatized today. And the biggest other issue that's stigmatized today is sexual health, which is the other area that you're working in.
Yeah, I suppose so. I say it's definitely an area that I feel very comfortable talking about, and an area that I don't have any qualms. I think that there's probably many reasons for that. I think growing up as a gay guy, I think it takes a certain amount of the stigma away anyway, because if you're part of a minority, I think immediately you just get maybe a little bit more confident to talking about things that other people maybe don't. And I think that another huge reason that there's problems there is around the lack of sexual education in schools.
We're crap at sexual education in Ireland.
Terrible. And it comes back, isn't it interesting? It comes back to education again. That's interesting. I think that here we are now talking about this completely different subject connected to health, and we're already back at education, because that is the first place to go in terms of prevention. There's lots of changes happening on the horizon around that. But again, not fast and not good enough for me anyway. I would like to see them moving a lot quicker on it, and I would like to see the compulsory directives being brought down from government level, from the Department of Education, about what needs to be covered while kids are in school. Because right now there's RSE, which is part of the SPHE subject, but
what is RSE?
So it's relationships and sexuality education, and it's part of the SPHE subject.
What is this?
SPHE is social personal health education.
Right.
But I would question how much of it actually gets covered, and even if it does get covered, is it enough? Because I'm meeting young people who, they don't know how to put on a condom.
See, on that topic, actually, I think that when I'm listening to you talking about this, I suppose the education of the kids is dependent on the education of the teachers, who are around about the same age as us, generally speaking. And like the sexual education that we got in school, I remember they split the boys and the girls up, and we ended up watching a movie or something, and they showed the girls how to put condoms on. I was thinking, like, this is maybe a little bit upside down here. Like, it's a strange way to run it.
Yeah, it can be, and I just think that there's still an awful lot of myths out there as well. I don't go into schools currently and do any sex education. It's definitely something that I'm hoping to do in the near future, but right now I don't. But I know that some of my colleagues who work in different areas of Ireland and things have had shocking things said to them when they've gone in, about like thinking that people could get pregnant from a toilet seat. That's still a big one out there. And thinking that you could get HIV from kissing. So I think that
you can't get pregnant the first time having sex.
It's very worrying when you hear people saying things like this, because you are really wondering, like, where is this coming from, and why isn't it being challenged in school, and why are they not learning the truth, and learning what they need to again lead a healthy, happy life, And I think there's probably a fear in schools around covering this subject, and I understand that, because for a lot of the people, I think you made a good point, they're often around our age or probably older, and they might have their own issues around sexual health in terms of like they didn't get it, they feel uncomfortable talking about it, and that's very much Ireland of the past. It's like we don't talk about sex. That's something that's brushed under the carpet.
It's nearly like we'll have to get the kids, the generation of kids now, to be comfortable talking about it, so that they can be comfortable talking to 100%. The next generation behind them.
The kids now are comfortable, because of course the other areas of sexual health, because I see sexual health as a kind of a holistic view of sexual health, so not just the act of sex and anything that might go with it in terms of contracting STIs or STDs, but also sexual orientation and then gender identity, which would be kind of the three areas. Kids are very knowledgeable these days now, but mainly because of the internet. Because they're out there researching it themselves, and the unfortunate part about that is that they're not always getting accurate information. I would say a lot of them are, but for every 8 that get accurate information, there's 2 that don't. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed as well. But I think young people these days are more attuned in terms of who they are, what they want to be doing, who they're attracted to, and how they identify themselves.
I'm just thinking back to whenever I was a teenager, and we were probably quite lucky in that our mum was a librarian, and she had had the conversation about sex a couple of times, and probably being a teenage boy at the time, I kind of shut it down quite fast. But she then got this book from the library and just left it in the front room where I was doing my study. And she's like, I'm just going to leave that there. I was like, oh, no, God, why did you even get that for it? It's disgusting. And then she went out for a walk, and I was straight into the front room. I was like flicking through it, trying to leave it back in the exact right place, so she thought she wouldn't know that I looked at it.
I had a very similar experience, and I don't know what the book you were given was called, but I got given Boy Talk. And yeah, he was left on my bed one day, and like that, I was disgusted. But I flicked through it pretty quickly, and I went back to it a few times. And I suppose in a way you kind of have to say we were lucky that we had mums like ours who gave us that book, because there was nothing else. If I didn't read that book, that was it. I didn't get it in school. I even remember having an interesting experience. This would have been around 2006, 2007, I'd say, being in an SPHE class, and the teacher was talking about relationships, and she kind of like asked me, she's like, oh, do you have a girlfriend? And like I was thinking afterwards, I was like, God, like, oh, even our questions are very loaded, because it's like she had made an assumption I was heterosexual. So of course, like, I just said no, but I didn't say I had a boyfriend. It was like that was a piece that was missing. So we even have to think about our language when we're teaching subjects like this, and we're talking about relationships to young people. We can't make any assumptions. We need to say things like, oh, are you in a relationship with someone, or things like that, because she shut me down straight away. And I think that's something that can happen quite a lot in these classrooms about various subjects, is people can get shut down because of the way questions are worded or the way teachers say things.
It feels like we're in a new era of terminology and kind of labels in a way. I use that kind of term sparingly or whatever, but there seems to be a conversation going on now about the way that labels are made on people. They think about gender pronouns and stuff like that there.
Yeah.
And what's the lowdown on that at the minute?
I suppose working with trans young people has taught me an awful lot around pronouns and around my own gender identity as well. I would have always identified as man, he, him pronouns, definitely present as a man, dress like one. You know, that's just what it would do, because for a long time when I was growing up, I only really saw men and women. I didn't see anything else that was non-binary or whatever. But I think that there's a whole area now that's much more visible than it ever was before. I think it always existed, but I just don't think it was visible. And I think that's what's happening now, is it's becoming more and more visible. And I think younger people are becoming more visible because they're more confident about it, which I think is a very positive thing. Essentially, I think that what is happening at the core of it all is that the gender construct is being challenged, which might not be a bad thing, because, you know, I think we have to remember that it is a construct. You know, like, you know, sex and gender are two separate things. So I'm not trying to say that like male and female are a construct. That's anatomy. Like, that's what your bits are essentially. But you know, we have intersex people, for example, who are neither male or female in sex. They're intersex. They might have both, or they might have markers where they have the hormone, like very high hormone levels, that might not be relating to the genitals they have. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And the prevalence of intersex people is quite high. It's 1 in 50 that are born. So I think in terms of gender then, gender is an identity. That is about how you express your sex and how you present that to the world, okay, and how you identify internally. So for me, this was a real education, because I was like, actually, I didn't really know what gender was before I started exploring and reading about this area, because I had kind of lumped gender and sex in to the same bed together as if they were the same thing, you know, just male and female, but they're not. Sex is male and female about your genitals, etc., but then gender is much more about how you express and present yourself to the world. And that made a lot of sense to me then. And up until, you know, I suppose the last 5 years is when it's become really visible in Ireland. We had kind of accepted the gender construct to be binary. You were either a man or you were a woman. And I definitely, when I was a kid, would have been aware of drag queens and cross-dressers. But I don't think even then we were really making sense that they were gender identities, whereas now they are gender identities.
In Irish, there's two separate words for sex and gender. Actually,
okay.
In a way.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Yeah. I think I get surprised when people seem to get offended if someone identifies as a certain way, because it's nobody else's business what way somebody wants to be identified. But is there a negative side to this thing that's happening today, where there's more and more different forms of sort of identity that people can attach themselves to?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm kind of going to probably go off on a mad one now with this, because I think this is a real area of interest for me. I'm somebody who really likes existentialism, so I could talk about identity all day long, but I don't think there's ever a negative side to anybody wanting to identify in any way other than the way they want to identify. And I think if anybody has a problem with that, that's their problem. I would very much view that, look at it in those plain, simple terms. Of course, it's never that simple, because sometimes people get a lot of abuse for wanting to identify differently, or for dressing a different way, in a way that's different from society wanting them to. And that can create a lot of problems for them in their life.
Does it work the other way as well? If, for example, people identify a certain way, but the other people around them don't know that person identifies a certain way, is there a thing where the person who has the sort of less common gender identity or whatever gets offended by the people who are around them?
I think it can be. I think that's a tricky one, because of course, like, a minority is always going to be on the defense, or most of the time anyway. That tends to be the way these things work. And I think that if somebody misgenders somebody, then there's two ways to look at it. And this is very much at the core now of the work that I do with young trans people around the issues that they might be facing in school. And there's always two sides to that coin. Sometimes people just misgender people because they forget, because maybe that person was once a different person to them. Maybe once they had a different name or a different gender identity. So that person is getting used to the fact that they're now identifying a certain way, if that makes sense. And they might make mistakes from time to time. Particularly parents, they struggle with it because they might have had a son born and that person is now identifying as female and has a female name. So the parent might be struggling to come to terms with that. But then the other side of it is where people are misgendering on purpose. And that's then the real dangerous element of society, you know. And interestingly enough, actually, I was part of a workshop last Saturday in Cork with a researcher from UL who's doing research on young trans people and their needs and experiences in schools, etc. And we heard from the young people, from some of the young people who attended, that their experience in school sometimes is that teachers actually misgender them and continue to do so, and apologise when they do and say that they were sorry, but they never get it right. And that for me then is where there's the flip side, you know. So that's not just a mistake. That's
let's say, for example, if so you identify as a woman and I say, or where is he, or something like that?
Exactly. Yeah, or they might continue to call them what's typically referred to in the trans community. And I use all of this terminology very lightly because I'm not trans myself. So sometimes I wonder if it's okay for me to be saying these things or not. But I think it's acceptable. Sometimes they refer to it as their dead name. Okay, and for a trans person, it can bring up a lot of emotion for them, and it can be very hurtful for somebody to use their dead name or to ask them what their dead name was. It's dead. It's no longer theirs as far as they're concerned, you know. So I think that they can be on the receiving end of what can be actually quite passive aggressive abuse. It's almost like bullying, really. And I think that comes from society in more general terms, because I think I always like to look at the root of these problems, and I think we have to, in order to see where this comes from, look at the power that the gender construct has in our society. And I mean, that's evident because we don't have to look too far to look at the inequalities between men and women. And I think like that's part of the gender construct. You know, it's about having these two opposing genders in a way, if you want to, you know. And you know, Jung is responsible in part for this because it was he who began writing about genders at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, and he played his own part in creating this gender construct about the difference between men and women. And I think that we don't have to look too far back to see where this has come from and realise that it is just a construct. It's something that people wrote about, that they created, that women are this way, that men are that way, that this is how we should behave. And I think what we're actually seeing in society now, Anla, is a very radical approach to gender, which is about trampling all over the previous notions that gender is binary, and saying that actually people come in many shapes, forms and sizes and colours, and that they're all okay, and that they should be able to identify in whatever way they feel comfortable.
But then if someone was born as a man and then identifies as a woman later on, is that not just another string to the bow of the gender construct?
It can be. So like some trans people will remain in the binary because they will go from being a male to a female, but then there's a whole host of people that will identify with completely different gender types, like non-binary, for example. So they don't prescribe to men or women. So they're the people that might want they, them pronouns, or a host of other pronouns as well. So they will not want to be referred to as he or she.
But if there's another one, is that not just another gender? Another one of the things that's the problem in the first place?
Well, there's lots of different talk about this at the moment, you know, about actually is what's happening here is that they're going to create so many that it's all just going to implode, and then we're just going to realise that this never mattered in the first place.
You should just have a name that you identify with, and then that's it.
This is interesting because over the last probably over the last 8 months, I would say, have been having my own existential questions and angst around who I am in relation to my gender and sometimes my uncomfortability with being a man and with being part of that group within society that is deemed to have more power, and particularly being a white man, because, you know, I'm going up on the privilege scale all the time. You know, I'm a white man and I'm from the West. Okay, that's another notch up again. You know, the fact that I'm gay, it keeps me down a little bit, but not much. And it's like, I've been trying to figure out, okay, do I want to be identifying as a man in society? Is that something that I feel comfortable with? And I have slowly, and it's not something I demand, because I think for a lot of people, when they look at me and go, he's a man. So they use he, him pronouns. So it's not something I jump in and go, you can't say that, I don't want to be identified that way. But I am asking people who know me to stop using he, him pronouns and to use my name. And the reason that I'm doing that is because my name is the only label that I feel entirely comfortable. And the reason is because it describes all of me. It's like my title if I was like a written piece of work. So therefore I feel very comfortable. But whereas if somebody refers to me as gay, or somebody refers to me as a man, or somebody refers to me as white, or somebody refers to me as Irish, that's only describing a part of who I am. So I'm not really comfortable with that.
Yeah, I can understand that as well. And I've got a couple other examples that kind of spring to mind when you're talking there. One, for example, is the podcast I did with a person who was living on the quays in the city centre, who abandoned all forms of name and just signs XX and has gone through the court system without a name because of the fact that that person didn't want to be attached to the label of the name, because maybe the name is sort of a burden in a sense as well. But the other thing that comes to mind there when you're talking is we do a lot of work with people who have varying levels of disability and stuff like that. Yeah. And from talking to some of the teenagers that we're working with, one of the things that constantly comes up is that they feel that people are labeling them as being disabled. Yeah. And that's not fair either, because it's just only like, I mean, that's a subjective term in itself. Yeah. And there's much more to them. And obviously I'm in a very privileged position to have gotten to know these people over the last number of years, and they're, you know, like unbelievable people. Whether or not they walk a little bit differently or don't walk at all is irrelevant.
Yeah, I didn't intend telling this story when I came on this podcast today, but it's funny how things came up. I got given a great gift when I was 16 years old that I didn't realise at the time, in terms of forming my identity. And it came from my own mother, who's a wonderful person. And I don't know if she knows the gift she gave me. We've never actually talked about it, but I'll get her to listen to this podcast now and we might have a chat about it afterwards. So, well, I told my mum I was 16. When I told her I was gay, I was 16. And we were in my school in Clonakilty in the principal's office. And I walked in and whatever happened. And then she just looked at me, as your mum would. And she said, sure, it doesn't matter. You'll always be John. And that really cemented for me a sense of who I was and a sense of what was important. And I don't know if she knew what she was doing. I'll guess not, because she's somebody who acts from her intuition quite a lot. But that's a very powerful message, you know, that actually this is irrelevant, because that's what the subtext was. You know, this is irrelevant because you're John, and that's what matters, you know. And I think that was a wonderful gift to be given, and I think that it has really stood to me in terms of how I identify within society. And that is that I'm John, and that's how people know me, and I'm great because there's so much under that umbrella. But I don't get pigeonholed because of I'm being gay or because I'm a therapist. And if people try and do that, often I'll rebel against it. Like, I'm like, no, I don't want that label there. Actually, it doesn't feel comfortable.
Seeing as we're sharing sort of pivotal mother stories from whenever we were teenagers, I have one of my own that I don't think my mum knows about either. But I remember must have been about 12 or something like that, and I remember coming into the kitchen in our house after playing out in the street. Well, like, we just spent a lot of time out in the street playing around anyway, and I came into the kitchen and said something like, my mum must ask me what I was up to or something, and I was like, oh, I've just met such and such a person. Obviously can't remember who it was now. I was like, they were weird. And she just looked at me and she was like, but maybe they're normal and maybe you're weird.
Yeah.
Like, how do you know that they're the weird one? Maybe you're the weird one and they're totally normal. And from that moment, it just kind of clicked that thing about judging people or kind of having an opinion about people. It's all very relative, and really it's irrelevant in a lot of ways.
Yeah, completely. And I think that identity is such a strong thing that runs through all of us, but we spend very little time examining it. And I think that that's something that really plays into our mental health as well, because at the core of a lot of problems are some existential problems, about not really feeling like people know who they are. And unfortunately, I just don't think that you can get through life without a period of time in which you just try and self-discover. Typically in the past that has happened an awful lot at middle age. There's always been that joke about having a breakdown, midlife crisis, the man who goes out and buys the sports car or whether quits the job, or the woman who quits everything and moves to the countryside, or whatever it might be. But I think that that's happening earlier now. I think less people are getting to midlife without knowing who they are, because they're being challenged by the existential questions much sooner. And I think that if you're somebody who has questioned your sexual identity or your gender identity, then you're doing that way earlier. So I think I'm kind of lining myself up not to be having a midlife crisis, because I've spent so much time examining those aspects of myself. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, but I think particularly for people who are questioning their gender, I think those existential questions are coming up way sooner than they ever have for people in society before. And that's another challenge for society, because teachers and parents aren't prepared for that, because in some cases they haven't even gone through it themselves.
Unreal. How can people, I think a good way of wrapping up the podcast would be maybe to put some resources on the table for people, if people are listening to this, and we've covered quite a lot of ground, I think. So there may be a few different resources that people may be able to go and find out about. If people are in a position where they would like to reach out because of a mental health issue they're experiencing at the minute, what would be a good route for them?
I think it all depends on the circumstance that they're in, and in terms of what they can do. If they want to go down the public services route, because that's what they can afford to do, which a lot of people are in that position, then there's a service called CIPSI, which is counselling in private or non-private in primary care. So if they go speak to their GP, then the GP can refer them onto that service. In a lot of cases, there's quite a lengthy waiting list, so you just have to be prepared for that. Alternatively, then they could seek out a private practitioner like myself. And in order to do that, you could go on a couple of different websites, but the website that I'd probably recommend would be IAHIP, which is the Irish Association of Integrative and Humanistic Therapists. And there'll be a directory on there where they can find therapists in their local area. In terms of other services then more focused on young people, you could go to Jigsaw. There's Jigsaw based in Cork, and there's lots of hubs dotted around the country as well. And they provide a really good service for people between, I'm not sure actually what the starting age is. I don't know if it's 16 or not, but it goes right up till 25. And Jigsaw are great because they're different to CAMHS, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, because at CAMHS you stop at 18. But Jigsaw kind of go, well, you don't become an adult, like we were talking about earlier, the minute you turn 18. So we work with people right up to 25. So they're two good services. If you're in a particularly bad situation and you need urgent assistance, then I would urge you to go to your GP as soon as possible. And they may refer you on to CAMHS if you're a child, or to the Adult Mental Health Service. And of course, anybody who might be listening that's in crisis, I would I would ask you to reach out to somebody like Samaritans, who offer 24/7 telephone counselling, or if you're in urgent need of help, to ring 999, because I think that's important. When we do these podcasts, often we forget that there could be people listening right now who are in a very bad place and need help, and sometimes they just need to hear it from somebody that they need to make that phone call now. Otherwise, then, in terms of services, I suppose it's about thinking about, if you don't want to go down the counselling and psychotherapy route, what are you looking for? Are you looking for help with career? Then maybe a guidance counsellor. There'll be a directory of guidance counsellors online. You can look that up. Or maybe a coach would be better for you, because you're looking to help you with some goals. And then the other thing I would be thinking would be something along the lines of personal development, for looking for a personal development course. I know the course you did was a qualification in Oxford, but I know there's shorter versions of those courses dotted all over Ireland, and I think they're, like you were saying earlier, they're always really good options for people in terms of creating more awareness about how they're feeling. So they're good personal development tools. And then for sexual health specifically, because that's one big area we've covered, in Cork specifically, there's a service called YHS, which is not too far away from here actually. It's near the train station in Cork, and that's the youth health service, but it's predominantly focused on sexual health, and they offer counselling and sexual health testing there, so go check them out. It's a free service run by the HSE for young people up as far as the age of 23.
Is that somewhere people can get contraceptives as well?
Yeah, they can get contraceptions there as well. They will discuss all contraception options there. And then the Sexual Health Centre, where I work, offers a range of services, from rapid HIV testing. So you can call in and get a rapid HIV test, and it'll be done in 30 seconds. And you can get that, you can ring up and book that whenever you want. It's free. And we offer counselling in the centre as well. And then last of all, particularly for young trans people that might be listening, or parents that might be listening of young trans people, there's two kind of main supports in Cork, which is Transformers, which I run. So if you want to attend Transformers, or if you're a young person, then you can contact me directly about that. And there's Transparency, which runs at the same time as Transformers, which is for the parents of the young people, and they run once a month, every month. But you can contact me about joining either of those. We don't give out locations and times for those, but you can just contact me and I can get in touch about that.
Are there a couple of websites people can go to as well to visit?
Yeah, so I suppose the big one around mental health would be Little Things. So the government launched a campaign a couple of years ago around mental health, and I think it's called littlethings.ie. So there's lots of information there about the support services that are available nationally and locally. And for sexual health, then I'd be urging you to go on to www.sexualhealthcentre.com, or onto Healthy Ireland or sexualwellbeing.ie. All of those have resources on them that if you might have questions. And then for young trans people, I'd be urging you to go and look at the TENI website, which is teni.ie. And for maybe young LGBT people, to be looking at Belong To. All of these have really good resources, because you never know, there might be a youth group or something in your local area that would be perfect, rather than doing one-to-one
There's
therapy.
spunout.ie as well. My friend Timmy Hammersley works for that organisation.
Yeah. That's a really good resource for young people in general. Yeah.
And last but not least, how can people keep in touch with what you're doing?
So I have my own website. It's www.johnfleming.ie. 1M in Fleming. Lots of people put in 2 and they miss me out. And I've got all the information on there. But I'm always willing to take phone calls, get emails from people. People might have questions about some of the things I talked today. Feel free to give me a call or drop me an email if you have a question. I'm always willing to talk to people about TA, because I'm passionate about teaching TA, and particularly about teaching TA in Ireland. So I'm always willing to have a chat with somebody about that. And if anybody is interested in working with me, having me into their school, having me into their youth group, or working with me on a one-to-one capacity, just get in contact.
Thank you.
No problem. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Sinead Kharja, episode 38 is in the bag. Gur mille maigad to John for taking the time out of his schedule and his day to record the podcast with me. Thanks to everyone who's been listening and who has been getting in touch. You know what to do at this stage. Share the episode around, get in touch on social media, and if you want to support the podcast, then you can find us on the Patreon platform, patreon.com/Rebel Matters, and you can go and check that out if you fancy it, and if you don't, of course, that's okay. The rest of the week for me now, I will be at the Sports Ability Day in the Mardic Arena on Saturday with the Ackley crew, and also hanging out with the Rebel Wheelers who we work with on a regular basis. The Sports Ability Day, this is our third year being over at it, and it is a really great initiative to help broaden the opportunities of participation in physical activity for people who have very wide-ranging disabilities, especially kids. To keep the children active and to create equal opportunities is a really important part of life, no matter how able or unable you are to perform any given task. So if you're around Cork, call over to the Mardic Arena on Saturday and come and have a chat with us if you fancy it. But other than that, thanks a million for listening. Can you fear agus go dtíon cead a rala, slán go fáil.